Early June 1942. I remember the light first, thin, pale, almost fragile as it spilled across the sand and low scrub of Midway Atoll. Dawn here never arrives with drama. It just settles in quietly like a hand on the shoulder. The kind of morning where the ocean looks harmless and the world feels too small for catastrophe. From my station near the radio hut, I watched another rotation of watchmen climb down from the tower, stretching, laughing softly, the way men do when they've convinced themselves nothing terrible is coming. Mechanics were already at work on the Wildcats. Old birds, paint-chipped, engines coughing even on their best days. The air smelled of hot metal and kitchen smoke drifting lazily from the mess tents. I could even hear fishermen arguing out on the pier about wind and tides, as if the war were continents away. Inside the radio room, the static was steady and familiar. I sifted through it the way I always did, trying to catch fragments that didn't belong, bits of coded chatter or strange bursts of tone. But that morning, there was nothing. Just the ordinary hiss of distance. The kind that tempts you into believing the world is calm, that the Pacific is nothing but water and birds and the occasional passing cloud. I remember leaning back in my chair, rubbing my eyes, telling myself we might have one more slow day before the next alert. One more sunrise without sirens. One more breath. But somewhere beyond the curve of the horizon, far past where our lookout towers could see, two vast fleets were already moving, closing the distance mile by silent mile. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers. Thousands of men on metal decks rising and falling with the swell. Engines thrumming. Radios whispering. Pilots tightening the straps on their flight gear. And none of us on Midway knew it yet. Not the fishermen on the pier. Not the cooks stirring their pots. Not even me with my ears pressed to the static. We lived that morning as if the world were holding steady. It wasn't. Whenever you're ready, I'll continue to the next section. At the time, all I really knew was the rumor, the Japanese don't lose. It drifted with the mail bags and old newspapers that took weeks to reach Midway. Malaya gone. Singapore fallen. The Philippines overrun. Each new scrap of news felt like another island sinking under the surface, and us sitting on our little sandbar waiting to see if we were next. Pearl Harbor was still a raw wound then. Some of the men on Midway had been there on December 7th. They didn't talk about it much, but sometimes in the mess their eyes would go distant when someone mentioned battleships. You could see the glow of burning oil reflected in faces that were staring at a tin mug of coffee. We were told almost nothing officially. The war at our level was just orders, patrol schedules, repair lists, and the unending hum of generators. But later, after it was all over, I learned what had been happening behind walls we never saw. Deep in a bunker in Hawaii, where a young cryptanalyst named Elias Turner stared at Japanese code groups until his eyes burned. While we listened to ordinary static, he listened to patterns. While I tuned out meaningless beeps and squeals, he tuned into small irregularities, repeated groups, tiny mistakes that men under pressure make when they think no one is watching. That was how he caught it. A designation, a logistics note, something about an operation focused on a place the Japanese called AF. On Midway, AF was just another pair of letters in a sea of acronyms. In Hawaii, Turner was convinced it meant us. He was right. On charts laid out in distant war rooms, two forces were closing in on that tiny bit of coral where I sat spinning dials. The Imperial Strike Force, under Vice Admiral Ricky Yames, moved with the calm arrogance of a navy that had done almost nothing but win for months. They believed we were blind, that we would stumble right into their trap. Against them, 3 American carriers, Liberty, Hawthorne, Seafarer, were rushing to our defense, still smelling of fresh paint and hurried repairs. Outnumbered, outgunned, but coming. We didn't know their names yet. We just knew something was building like pressure behind a door. And that, one way or another, it was coming here. I first sensed the shift not from any message or warning, but from the tension in the officers' voices as they moved through the radio hut. Orders were sharper, footsteps faster, conversations clipped short whenever I came within earshot. Something in the air felt tighter, stretched thin, as if the whole island were holding its breath. We still hadn't been told what the Japanese were planning, only that the next days would require heightened readiness. A phrase the Navy used when it didn't want to say, "prepare to die." Later I learned that Yames, miles away on the deck of his flagship, believed he held the perfect trap. He thought he would strike Midway, draw out our carriers, and crush them in one decisive blow. His pilots trained for that moment with the confidence of men who had never tasted real defeat. They rehearsed launches with almost ceremonial precision, convinced that victory was already written. But our plan was built on something he didn't know, the broken fragments of his own code. The Americans meant to ambush him instead, an invisible strike shaped not by guns or aircraft, but by pens scratching over intercepted messages. I was only a technician, a man with headphones pressed to his skull, but even I could feel the weight of the unseen machinery turning far beyond our atoll. Just before dawn on the day the operation began, the horizon faded into a deep, bluish gray, the kind that makes the ocean look like polished metal. I stepped outside for a breath of air and noticed a faint tremor under my boots. Not an earthquake, but the rumble of aircraft warming up somewhere inland. Engines coughed, roared, settled into rhythm. It was the sound of Japan taking the first step. Hours later, we learned the truth. Yames had launched dozens of planes toward Midway. His opening move glided flawlessly into the sky, wings gleaming in the early light. But perfection didn't survive the first night. The initial crack came quietly, almost insignificantly, a report of gunfire from the northwest. Then a trembling voice cut through our radio static. Torpedo boats engaging enemy picket ships. Mark Dallas leading a night attack. I didn't yet know his name, only the urgency in his transmissions, sharp and breathless. Within minutes, word reached us. An ammunition barge had been hit and destroyed. One barge. One small explosion in the vast Pacific. Yet it shattered the smooth timing Yames depended on. It forced him to adjust, to wait, to recalculate. Minutes lost. Minutes he would soon crave like oxygen. At the time, I didn't fully understand what I was hearing. I only knew this. The storm we had feared for months had finally broken open, and the first crack of lightning had already split the night. Morning of June 4th arrived like a blade through the quiet, slicing away whatever illusions we still held. I had barely slept. None of us had. The air in the radio hut felt charged, heavy with the sense that something vast and unseen was shifting just beyond the curvature of the sea. Before sunrise, distant echoes rolled across the atoll, faint and uneven, like someone dropping crates far offshore. A few of us paused, listening. Then the realization struck. Those weren't crates. Those were bombs. By the time the sky turned pale gold, Japan's first strike had fallen on Midway. I felt the ground tremble under my boots as explosions tore through fuel tanks and runways. Dust shook from the rafters above me with every detonation. Through the narrow radio hut window, the horizon pulsed in orange and black. Yet despite the storm overhead, the defenders of the island, Major Alex Brewer's men, did something I still think about to this day. They sent every flyable plane into the air, even those barely patched together. Some of them sputtered as they lifted off, engines coughing like dying lungs. Most never made it past the outer reef. One by one, the Japanese Zeros tore them apart. I listened helplessly as pilots shouted last coordinates, last warnings, last breaths. In the midst of that slaughter, something unexpected happened. Yames misread the chaos. He saw the scattered American aircraft and believed Midway still had strength left. That hesitation, those few moments of uncertainty, cast a shadow over his decisions, freezing him between choices: strike the island again or search for our carriers. And while he paused, our counterblow slowly assembled. I remember the radio suddenly filling with frantic chatter, reports of torpedo squadrons launching, of pilots steeling themselves for runs they knew were suicide. Franklin Cole's torpedo bombers went first. I caught fragments of their transmissions, voices tight with fear but steady. Then the sounds turned to static, broken by flashes of screaming. Zero fighters swept down on them like hawks, cutting them apart over the open water. Not one torpedo found its mark. Their sacrifice had bought us nothing. Or so we thought. Only later did I learn how wrong that was. By dragging the Japanese fighters down to sea level, those men, those doomed pilots, left the sky above the fleet momentarily unguarded. A window had opened, though none of us yet understood its significance. The next hours blurred into a vicious rhythm of alarms, attack warnings, and emergency transmissions. Planes dove. Ships maneuvered. Everything felt like a furnace: heat, smoke, desperation, burning through the hours. Every time I thought the worst had passed, a fresh wave of explosions rolled across the island. The ocean itself seemed to be groaning under the cost of each minute. And somewhere in that chaos, I felt it. The battle was changing shape, tilting, twisting, preparing for something irreversible. The moment before the fall of an empire rarely announces itself loudly. More often, it whispers through static. In the middle of that chaos, burning fuel tanks, shattered runways, radios crackling with half-lost voices, what I remember most is the silence inside myself. A strange, steady quiet that settled in as if some part of me already knew the day was turning toward a knife-edge moment. The bombardment of Midway slowed, then faded. Brewer's surviving crews crawled from craters and broken hangars. Smoke curled upward in thin black ribbons. For a breath, the island seemed suspended between life and death. But miles away, beyond the haze, other stories were unfolding. Individual choices made by men who would never know how much they shaped the fate of that day. One of them was Howard Mason, a reconnaissance pilot I had spoken to only twice. He had a quiet voice, almost shy, the kind of man you wouldn't look at twice in a crowd. Yet sometime that morning, flying low on fuel, he saw a faint smear of smoke far out on the horizon. He should have turned back. Any sane man would have. But something in him refused. He pushed farther, beyond his orders, beyond reason, until his voice came tearing into my headset with a clarity that froze me. Enemy fleet spotted. Multiple carriers. Coordinates. A scribbled note. A trembling hand. History turning. Almost at the same moment, on the deck of the Liberty, a mechanic named Tom Reyes was wrestling with the jammed aircraft elevator. I later heard from a pilot that Tom held the platform in place with his own blistered hands while the ship shook under near misses. The last squadron of dauntless bombers clattered into position because one man refused to let an elevator slip. Then there was Henry Mills, steady Henry, always humming while he worked. When the bombardment hit our communications post again, he shoved me aside and took over the transmitter, sending the final coordinates Mason had risked his life to deliver. Shells landed close enough to rattle the equipment on the tables. The walls groaned. Something overhead cracked. Henry didn't flinch. He kept tapping out the message until the last letter left the wire. When he finished, he looked at me with dust on his eyelashes and said, "That's it. They've got the numbers." Those three men never met. Mason in the sky, Reyes on the Liberty's trembling deck, Mills in our battered radio room, but their choices aligned like links in a chain being pulled taut. By late morning, the shape of the battle had changed. We could hear it in the shift of transmissions, the rising urgency in carrier communications, the sudden sharp calls for dive bomber formations to regroup. Something enormous was building beyond our sight. I felt it like a storm pressing down on the air, the kind that turns the sky heavy before the first flash. Every war has a hinge, one moment when everything tilts. Ours was only minutes away. At 10:14 a.m., the hinge finally turned. I didn't see the dauntless bombers appear, but I heard them, first as faint tremors in the radio waves, then as clipped, breathless confirmations from pilots who had clawed their way through cloud cover to find the Japanese fleet stretched below them like a map laid open by fate. Daniel O'Neill's voice cut through the static with a steadiness that made my skin prickle. There was no triumph in it, no excitement. Just the grim focus of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to do. Below him, Yame's fighters were still chasing the last of our torpedo planes near sea level, the sky above the carriers left exposed, unguarded at the worst possible moment. I imagined it as O'Neill must have seen it. Enemy decks lined with fueled and armed aircraft, crews scrambling, unaware of the shadows gathering overhead. Then came the dive. The radio filled with a harsh, rising roar, wind tearing against cockpit frames, engines screaming as the Dauntless plummeted almost vertically. Someone shouted a target name half swallowed by static. Someone else whispered a prayer. A heartbeat later, the first explosions ripped across the channel, sharp and violent enough that even from Midway I felt a low vibration through the floor. Reports began flooding in. Emoji hit. Rinzen burning. Shoryu engulfed. 3 carriers struck almost simultaneously, as if some invisible hand had pressed down on all of them at once. Flames rose high enough that pilots could see them even as they pulled out of their dives, wings trembling from the strain. For long seconds I just sat there, headset pressed tight, listening to the tone of the Japanese transmissions shifting from disciplined precision to ragged confusion. Orders overlapped. Voices cracked. Someone was shouting for damage control teams. Another called for fire crews that no longer existed. You could hear the collapse in real time, the sound of certainty dissolving. But the battle wasn't finished with us yet. The Hokuryu, the last carrier still operational, launched a final desperate strike. I heard the warning come through, enemy aircraft inbound, Hawthorne targeted. The next moment spiraled into panic. The Hawthorne's deck crews scrambled to clear space. Anti-aircraft guns erupted. But it wasn't enough. When the hit came, the voice reporting it was tight with pain, Hawthorne crippled, listing, smoke pouring from her flight deck. Still, she stayed afloat. And then the counterattack began. The Hokuryu, Japan's last hope in that moment, took bomb after bomb until the signal reporting her position cut out entirely. When contact resumed, it was only to say she was gone, swallowed by fire and water. After that, the air went strangely quiet. No more attack warnings. No more frantic commands. Just the soft hum of background static and the distant crackle of burning ships. The strike force Yames had built his hopes on, for carriers, thousands of men, the pride of an empire, had been shattered in less than an hour. I took off my headset for a moment, hands shaking, and stepped outside into the sunlight. Smoke still smeared the sky to the west, but the wind had shifted, and for the first time that day Midway felt strangely still. We had survived. But the ocean beyond us was a graveyard. When the roaring finally faded and the radio traffic thinned to scattered fragments, a strange hush settled over Midway. It wasn't peace. Nothing about that day could ever be called peaceful, but it was the sound of a tide turning. I stepped outside, letting the salt wind cool the sweat on my face, and watched the horizon tremble with distant columns of smoke. They rose in dark, trembling pillars, marking the graves of ships whose names I had never known until that morning. Inside the intelligence tent, reports began to solidify. For Japanese carriers gone. Thousands dead. The core of their striking arm, finished. I listened as officers spoke in low, stunned tones, struggling to reconcile what they had hoped for with what had actually happened. Months earlier we had been reeling, losing ground across the Pacific, watching the map shrink around us. Now, in a single day the Japanese Navy had bled out almost beyond recovery. But victory never feels clean. Our own losses weighed heavily. Hawthorne limped in the water, scarred and smoking. Squadrons had been torn apart. Pilots I knew by voice alone, men whose chatter had filled my early mornings, were gone. Their last transmissions replayed in my mind, clipped and rushed, sometimes ending mid-syllable. War does not allow you to mourn individually, it hands you grief by the dozens. As the hours passed, the scale of what had happened came into sharper focus. Japan had lost not just ships but the very ability to project its power. With its veteran pilots dead and its carriers sunk, the empire's offensive momentum collapsed. Radio intercepts from their surviving escorts were fragmented, frantic, soaked in disbelief. Yames had gone silent. Some said he refused to leave the burning deck. Others claimed he was already lost with his flagship. No one knew for sure. What mattered was that the man who believed he could lure us into his trap had watched the trap collapse around him. On Midway, the men who could still stand moved through the wreckage of the morning's bombardment. Craters smoked. Debris crackled underfoot. The air smelled of burned rubber, scorched palm trunks, and sea brine. Medics carried stretchers between shattered buildings, their faces blank with exhaustion. Brewers surviving air crews slumped beside their aircraft, the ones that remained, staring at the sky as if expecting another wave that would never come. I found Henry Mills sitting on an overturned fuel drum near the radio shack, his hands still shaking slightly from the violence of the day. He gave me a tired grin and said, "Feels like we've been holding up the whole Pacific with our bare hands." And in a way we had. That night, I sat alone with the receiver, listening to the quiet hiss of an ocean that only hours earlier had been alive with fire. Somewhere out there, the remnants of the Japanese fleet were retreating into darkness, leaving trails of oil behind them. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but something had changed, something irreversible. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, we weren't just enduring the storm. We were turning it,